We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, Culture Editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe wherever you download your podcasts as well. Today, we're joined once again by Chris Fenton. Chris is a film executive. He's also the author of the excellent book, Feeding the Dragon, Inside the $1 Trillion Dilemma Facing Hollywood, the NBA, and American Business. Chris, welcome back to the show.
Oh my God, it's always such a pleasure to be on with you. So thanks for having me back. Always honored.
Of course. And the occasion today is that Chris has a great piece out in American Thinker titled Recognizing America's Leverage with Beijing 2022. So now Chris spends a lot of time talking about China's relationship with Hollywood and about America's relationship with China in general. But I thought, Chris, this one was really interesting, sort of your foray into the sports world. You've written about the NBA, of course, before as well. But this makes a really nuanced point. Not that perhaps an outright boycott to announce it immediately on the basis of human rights complaints would be effective, but to say, actually, there's leverage. Can you walk us through that argument a little bit?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't want to take a full credit for this boycott discussion because I actually have the honor and I'm super humbled that U.S. Naval Captain Corey Ray, who's a professor at the National War College, has me come every semester and talk to his soft power influence class. And it's really unbelievable because you realize how deep into the culture and strategy of the Pentagon actual soft power plays are. I mean, it goes back into the 1950s when the CIA and the Pentagon were using soft power diplomacy to try to win over some of the African countries from going communist. And it plays out all the way through the Berlin Wall. In fact, I talk about it a little bit in the book. But then you look at the Olympics, and Captain Ray and I were talking about it, and we actually have slightly different points of view on the actual idea of a boycott. So we thought, hey, wouldn't it be interesting if I wrote an op-ed and then I could incorporate some of his dissenting view on it? Because he feels that if you look historically in the past, boycotts themselves don't tend to actually have the rigor of a constructive solution in the way that people think they would. So I actually said, you know what? I think the question isn't whether we should boycott the Olympics, right? Because we've seen a lot of people talking about, hey, should we boycott or not? I think instead we should look at the leverage that we have between now and February of 2022 and say, what do we want to accomplish that's practical, that shows a constructive maneuvering towards whatever our North Star is overall with China, and try to implement those changes and those directives with the Chinese Communist Party in exchange for promising to show up at those Olympics. And we should do that also with our Western allies, because if you look at what the Olympics represent to China, and I talk about it in the op-ed piece, it's very similar to what I experienced in Beijing 2008, that Summer Olympics, except the period of time, the history of what China is today is very different from back then. Back then, I talk about it being sort of their debutante party or their coming of age party. They were, in its sort of infancy, developing nation stage. And then that 2008 Olympics was their coming of age into the world of adulthood. Now they're in adulthood. In fact, I argue that the WTO should designate them as a developed country rather than a developing country because of that. But this Beijing 2022 Olympics is not a debutante party anymore. Instead, it's more like a fancy dinner party. And in order to pull off a great fancy dinner party, as you know, you want to send out invitations to people and you want them all to accept and show up. Any empty seats is a loss of face. And in China terms, that loss of face has huge ramifications for that government.
Now, so part of what's so interesting about this op-ed is that you have a list of 8 demands. So you say specifically, China should expect an Olympic boycott from America and our allies unless these suggested requests are agreed to. I mean, the first one is full unrestricted access for unscheduled inspections of Uyghur facilities in Xinjiang. They have, you have granting Daryl Morey's Philadelphia 76ers and the NBA overall complete access to China's market again. I mean, this is like ending CCP market retaliation against companies or individuals who use their freedom of speech rights while outside PRC borders. Aren't these kind of non-starters, don't you think? Is this part of your art of the deal to sort of bring them over on some points, even if some of them probably are total non-starters?
Yeah, I think what I was trying to do was come up with suggested ideas that would allow us the ability to check some boxes, right? And I wanted them to be relatively practical in their own isolated stage. So if you look at full unrestricted access to Xinjiang province and the Uyghur facilities, what I'm not doing is saying end the atrocities that are happening to Uyghurs, stop the, genocide that's happening. I'm not trying to corner the Chinese into an accusation that we all believe is 100% true. They're defending it and say we're manipulating data or circumstantial evidence, whatever it is. If there's something happening there, I want to find out about it by actually doing the research and being on the ground and having access to it. If there's nothing on the ground there happening, then they should provide us that access. And of course, it's got to be unscheduled, because anytime you schedule something to make a visit there, they're going to manipulate exactly what you see. So that idea is trying to get to a North Star. Say there is genocide there, we want to end that genocide. But the first step is at least have access so we can actually see it, touch it, feel it, and the global community can then respond accordingly. So I feel like that's a bit of a baby step approach. Now, granted, it could be unrealistic in that aspect, but I gave 8 ideas, and I think a few of them we can actually push and get done, especially if we get our Western allies on board.
Yeah, and what do you think the likelihood of, what would this ultimately look like? So if we take these 8, I think, fantastic suggestions or negotiation points that you suggest in this op-ed, and we look at, the end goal, which is to resolve some of the ways that China treats its own people and some of the ways China wreaks mayhem on the international stage for our country and our people, what do you think the ultimate sort of compromise or the ultimate even sort of non-compromise will look like? Are we just heading towards an impasse? Are we heading towards total concession on the United States part, showing up in Beijing no matter what? Or are we heading to something where we can really pull our Western allies in one direction that can then pull China in one direction when it comes to these Olympics?
Yeah, well, first of all, in the book, as you know, I talk about Fenton's 5 forces of diplomacy, and 3 of them, politics, national security, and human rights, we don't agree with them on. And I don't see anytime soon bringing them to our side of the playing field. But where we do have common ground is in cultural and commercial exchange. And the Beijing Olympics of 2022 is a huge moment of cultural and commercial exchange. And there are a lot of entangled webs that we're all a part of globally in wanting to perform and show up at those Olympics. So what I think is, look, if I bring it back to the most simple, yet also some of the most complicated and controversial aspects of problems that we have with China, at least here in the United States and the free world, number one is the encroachment of freedom of speech rights. Daryl Morey has, obviously exercised his freedom of speech rights in Houston, Texas, back in October of 2019. And he is still paying the price for that, as is the NBA. My feeling is that we need to move past that with China and essentially say, China, you have bifurcated the World Wide Web. You have a firewall there. You can censor things from your populace, from them ever knowing it ever existed. In the case of Daryl Morey, he said things that you could have easily kept your populace from hearing or ever digesting in any sort of geopolitical controversy. So you should allow those freedom of speech rights, not just for Daryl Morey back in 2019, but for athletes and companies and essentially political figures and everybody else when they're in their own land. They should be able to have those freedom of speech rights. And you can do what you want to do within your borders. You can separate that free speech right from your own populace and prevent them from hearing it. And the same thing I want to see with athletes being able to be vocal about the issues they have with China in regards to as they are heading over there. They should be able to talk about the human rights issues. They should be able to talk about Hong Kong or Taiwan or whatever their issue is. And then when they actually get on the ground in China, they should be able to do it once again. And if China wants to censor it within their nation, they can. But they should be able to get their free speech out to the rest of the world. And it should be done without retaliation. Now, one of the things that will happen is that because of the nationalistic push in China, some of the public will hear some of these criticisms that athletes make. And that means they'll be less valuable to the consumer in China. And that's something that Chick-fil-A speaking out about gay marriage or Hobby Lobbies doing what they do, that's going to cut off some of their consumer base. That is one of the ramifications of free speech. And we should be okay with that. Consumer sentiment can't change by what you say. But what I like about the idea of athletes taking a stand when they are on the ground in China is that the rest of the world will hear what they say. So any little bit of value they lose in the China market, they could actually gain globally, almost in sort of a Muhammad Ali type of aura, right? And actually by taking a stand on something where they actually lose consumer base in China, they could actually create more value for themselves elsewhere around the world while also doing a good thing.
Were you at the Beijing Olympics in 2008?
I did not go to the Beijing Olympics in 2008. It was actually very complicated to get there. But I worked on behalf of a bunch of different companies because we were an ad agency of record for many of them in regards to moving their business forward with my colleagues on the ground in Beijing who were actually there in real time. So it was an unbelievable event. And it was actually extremely securitized as far as the way they pulled it off. But it went off, at least for the rest of the world, very flawlessly. And because of that, they expect the same thing to happen with Beijing 2022.
I was going to say, the reason I ask is because in retrospect, some of what we kind of marveled at as Americans at the time, the beautiful, synchronized dances and the performances and the pomp and circumstance, it was, in retrospect, it's very telling and almost kind of chilling to think back on. When you think back on the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing and some of the symbolism that was pushed really heavily from the CCP, what do you think the lesson is now that we're, more than 10 years removed from it and in a really different era geopolitically?
Well, one thing I know for certain was the lead up to the 2008 Olympics was huge. So everything in China within a couple years of when those Olympics began, everything was sort of slowed down and all focus was put on pulling off the greatest party on earth. And if it didn't go off perfectly, there would have been big ramifications for it, not just for the populace there, but for the leadership itself. The leadership was there proving how great a government they are to their 1.4 billion people. So the same thing is going to be happening over the next 300 days in that country, even though they've come a completely long way. I mean, they probably had 400 million in their middle class back then. They have 800 million now. They arguably have one of the biggest, if not the biggest GDPs on earth. Their market is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, for most industries and most global businesses right now. It has come a long way. But the one thing for certain that's going to happen over these next 300 days is anything sensitive that might harm the perfection of what Beijing 2022 is going to be a massive pressure point. So that was my point in the op-ed, which is let's take advantage of that. I was a former athlete, definitely not Olympic caliber, but I do know, and in fact, I did a couple of sports growing up that are really strenuous when it comes to training for big events like that. Like, for instance, I was a swimmer, and you actually have to time over the course of like 4 years this thing called a taper event. So you're actually at the peak physical condition, and your blood, you're essentially, your pulse rate's at its lowest, and you can perform your best. And it's like this whole 4-year process of trying to get those like 10 days to work perfectly. And I look at that and I think of the average athlete that competes in the games. They're not Michael Phelps. They're not multimillionaires. In fact, they live paycheck to paycheck, and they've trained their whole life and sacrificed to be there. So I would like to see them compete. And I think all of us would. But we do have a real point of leverage that we rarely have without military force with China. And I'm imploring us to look at it, examine it, and figure out how do we best use it. I suggested 8 ideas. I by far don't say those are the ones we should go for, but I think others should be talking about this, and we should address it immediately because we're running out of time.
What do the Olympics mean to China? In other words, what is so beneficial from their perspective of hosting these games? How do you think they see its effect on their reputation and on their power overall? Why do they want this, and why do they want to pull it off?
Well, I think number one is it creates this common challenge, this common sort of goal for the country to prepare for something that's so big and eventful. And a lot of that has to do with getting the excitement and the support to build massive infrastructure, right? And in a way, Los Angeles is doing the same thing for 2028. You can see some of those infrastructure goals moving forward in a much slower kind of way because we have lots more regulation and all that kind of stuff than they do in China. But it does become that common purpose that rallies people, and it creates a nationalistic pride. I think one of the interesting parts about this particular Olympics is the pressure is off the athletes in China to perform, right? Because a lot of these sports, they're actually not very good at, and they've only been playing for a certain amount of time, whether it's hockey or skiing or whatever it is. So really their emphasis can be on putting the best party possible on display for the world to see. Whereas in summer 2008, there was lots of pressure for the gymnasts and all the different sports and the athletes to win golds because they had been training these Communist Party training camps since the 80s.
That's that's pretty crazy to think about.
But one thing is that China, remember, the Chinese Communist Party, the number one goal is to keep 1.4 billion people just happy enough that they don't revolt, right? And the best way to create that aura of an amazing government is to create an awe around the world about what your country is doing and what it's accomplished and where it is on that given day. And if they pull this off in the way that they expect, they're going to showcase one of the largest and most advanced, airports on Earth, high-speed rail, all kinds of different infrastructure projects that will blow the minds of a lot of people around the world. And that's what they want to do. And then they're going to siphon all of that news globally and essentially put it into context through the Ministry of Propaganda to disseminate around their own populace, essentially saying, hey, look at us. We are the leaders of the world. Everybody's talking about us.
So you released your book last July, and I remember when we talked, I think it was still 2019, and that was after the sort of Hong Kong protests had sprung up, and there was conversation about Daryl Morey and all of that. How do you think, now that America is under new leadership, how do you think some of this has changed, both from maybe China's perspective? We've also, I can't believe I actually forgot that also over the course of that time, we entered into a pandemic and we're still in it. It's easy to just sort of like accept it and be numb to it as the new normal. But with all that's changed, geopolitically and culturally over the last 18 months, how do you think the relationship between the United States and China has changed? How has that situation shifted, if at all?
Well, I think a couple of things. When we first started talking, which I think was December 2019, there was a combo of Donald Trump pulling the fire alarm that China was a threat to all Americans. And then there was the Daryl Morey tweet, which sort of balanced the right-leaning alarm with sort of a left awakening of what we were doing corporately with that country in regards to getting access to our products and services to that massive consumer base. So when we started talking, there was an awareness of both, essentially a national security threat and an economic threat. On top of it, we also saw a political threat, which was Hong Kong and what was happening there. And I had just gotten back from a U.S. congressional delegation trip early that September 2019, where we actually met with protesters and we met with Carrie Lam. And then we also were up in Beijing meeting with party members and hearing essentially the Hong Kong situation play out in real time from different sides of the story. So that was also happening. Now, after we started talking, what we didn't expect was the COVID situation to rear its head. And of course, a lot of us were thinking that was a problem that was stuck over there around that time. And then it came over here. What was amazing that I don't think you or I could have ever predicted was that all this uproar over what was happening in Hong Kong, we suddenly would lose our attention on that. And we would be looking at all kinds of other things going on, including the political divide here in the upcoming election. And we took our eye off the ball of Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has been completely taken back by the Chinese. It's essentially no longer one country, two systems. And in fact, just this week, they've really removed some of the elected seats in their government there. So now it's just simply a branch of the Chinese Communist Party out of Beijing. So that was a big one. Number two was, none of us, I think you and I and many others were awoken to the problem with China, but I don't think we knew all the tangibles. And I think COVID brought to life these national security issues that we had, whether it was with pharmaceutical manufacturing, whether it was with the PPE stuff, whether it was all kinds of supply chain issues, technology, the fact that the WHO might be compromised in regards to how they approach China versus the welfare of the world. We had CDC issues in regards to getting right type of research and investigative processes done to figure out COVID. And it obviously started to seem like China was on their own and doing it their way, and they didn't care about us. And we started to really go, oh, we got to get decoupled from them because they are now more of a threat than we ever expected. And that has all led into what was a very rancorous, I don't know if that's a word, but lots of rancor in the in the lead up to the election, where China was the common enemy of both parties. So that ratcheted up the tension between the two countries. And then there was a real question as to whether President Biden was going to take the reins of what Trump had left behind in regards to this tough approach to China. And what some of us were a little nervous of, including me, was that he was going to go back to more of an Obama approach. But the nice thing is that there's enough scrutiny put on what he does with China that it's sort of forcing him into a position where he has to continue the same game. So I'm feeling like if you look at who he surrounded himself with, whether it's Blinken, Sullivan, Rosenberger, Campbell, et cetera, they're up there with some of the hawks from, Navarro to Pottinger to, Pompeo, et cetera. So I do think I'm feeling hopeful that we are looking at China not as a like a hot military threat or a threat where we want to fully decouple from, but we're also looking at the fact that a disruptive change needs to occur in the bilateral relationship, and we're running out of time to do it.
Do you think that Democrats in the United States really do see China as an enemy? It's kind of odd, and this is something you've chronicled and experienced firsthand, that there's this hawkishness towards China on the Republican side of the aisle that is sort of surprising from perhaps the party that was perceived at least as being more pro-business for decades. And now there's this sort of hawkish attitude towards a country where there is frankly a lot of business and a lot of money to be made. But do you think that things have evolved after the pandemic and the Hong Kong situation, and the more we learn about what's happening to the Uyghurs? Do you think the Democratic Party, have you sensed that they have really meaningfully moved beyond sort of posturing or answering begrudgingly to questions about the Uyghurs and whether that constitutes a genocide? Do you think that they actually have made meaningful shifts when it comes towards how we approach China?
It's an unbelievable question that I've been living firsthand. I consider myself a nonpartisan populist or a nonpartisan patriot. But I have admitted, and I admit in the book, that I've been a lifelong Democrat. I do not see things on party lines whatsoever. And in fact, I think that's one of the faults of our nation, is that a lot of people do. But it has been extremely frustrating to write a book that I think is extremely approachable for both sides of the aisle, and to have a really hard time getting on left-leaning programs, ones that I watch, my parents watch, that the West Side of LA watches, because those are important audiences that I got to reach on this challenge that confronts us all. In fact, I was doing an interview yesterday with NPR, which was great because I really am trying to balance one platform with another as much as I can. And they asked a similar question. And I said, what's interesting that I'm finding is, and because I had some affiliation with the Saudi Arabian government at one time, and I almost got into business pre-Khashoggi with them in certain ways, that the left is so ravenously objecting towards certain things that the Saudi Arabian government does, yet seems to put its head in the ground, in the sand when it comes to China. And the reverse is sort of what happens on the right. And it's interesting if you look at the money that's involved with both, right? On the right, there's a lot of support for the energy business, the Pentagon, military industrial complex, et cetera, hard, sort of manufacturing and businesses that rely on Saudi Arabia, versus if you look at China, some of the businesses that are really booming there, a lot of them are tech, from the Teslas to the Apples to the Starbucks to the Hollywood business to NBA, cultural stuff, a lot of left-leaning industries and businesses. So you can see how the money is causing the different sides of the aisle to object to what is essentially similar human rights abuses and other issues that we have. What I will say is that over time, I've been starting to get more and more on left programs. I think you can see everybody from Jake Tapper on the left to Chuck Schumer to bipartisan support for certain things on the China side. It's starting to take hold. And what I love about this China challenge, and we talked about common purpose and common challenges, is that, I moved here just before the 94 earthquake in Los Angeles, and I lived in an apartment building where like no one liked each other. It was crazy. I mean, it was all walks of life. It was, I was a waiter. No one had any money, and everybody was
Olive Garden waiter, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. And everybody was in each other's grill. But the second the earth shook, for what seemed like 5 days, we were all out in the street helping each other out, sharing food, sharing news that we were hearing, all that kind of stuff. It was the great sort of common thread that united us. And I see China as the same thing, right? If we look at China as a national security problem, as an national economic problem, as something that is part flight and fight, when it comes to instincts of humans, those are great common instincts that you can unite around against a common challenge. And that's what China can be. And I'm starting to see essentially the green sprouts of bipartisan work to try to address the China situation. So to answer your question, yes, the right has been on it for a lot longer, and they continue to be much more hawkish and I think much more disciplined about doing something with China. But I am starting to see signs of life that the left is joining.
Bill Maher made a really interesting point a few weeks back. I don't know if you saw it, but he said It was when the Dr. Seuss controversy was kind of exploding over here in America. And he was saying, you know, who's not offended by Chinese caricatures or Chinese stereotypes in children's books? The Chinese. You know, while we are sort of squabbling or mired in these kind of identity politics squabbles, they are building an insane infrastructure. They're doing X, Y, and Z. And while I think Mar downplayed the efficiency that comes with being an autocracy, you know, that's kind of an important point of why they're able to be so efficient, because they have an inordinate amount of control over their people. But at the same time, do you think he has a point there that while in America we spend so much time distracted and consumed by these identity politics battles, that they're sort of like eating our lunch in a way that, to use Joe Biden's phrase, in a way that we may not even fully be aware of until like 10 years down the road when we find ourselves behind on all of these important metrics?
No, well, Bill was right on the mark. I mean, I you know what? For somebody that's so on the left, he does bring another point of view. He has Kellyanne Conway on, or Rick Santorum, or whatever it is. I like that about him, as he tries to get the other angles, and he's been very critical on the left for various things. And I thought that China rant that he had the other day was fantastic. And it's a little bit of the tip of the iceberg, because we do have this cultural identity, however we want to call this warfare, the cancel culture warfare that's going on, that definitely divides us and further separates us, which is a terrible situation. But one of the things I know with 100% certainty is that China has a lot of people. You're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions, that are specialists when it comes to social media propaganda. Mm-hmm. And they do it for their own populace for sure. But then they also have their wolf warrior diplomacy and their social media platforms spread of propaganda working throughout the Western world. We give them full access to our Twitters and our Facebooks and all that kind of stuff, and they take full advantage of it. And you can guarantee that anything that is creating a wedge between people of the United States of America is getting gasoline poured on that fire by China. The Chinese Communist Party is really good at inflaming problems, at creating nationalistic values and drive within their own people. They can turn sentiment on a dime. I saw it in 2012 when there were uprisings. In fact, there were Uyghur terrorist events happening in China real time. And there was definitely kindling that was starting to light that the CCP was getting rather concerned about. So they immediately flipped the switch into one of nationalistic pride and a false flag narrative by essentially starting this weird war over the Senkaku Islands that have been disputed between Japan and China. And suddenly everybody changed their attention from all this unrest that was starting to bubble up in China to one that was filled with the pride of China. And you started seeing car dealerships that were, Toyota and Nissan having cars turned over or lit on fire or whatever. So they can do that in their own country, and they can do it really well in others. And I can tell you with 99.9% certainty, and I'm sure lots of cyber experts would agree, that this Asian hate narrative that's being put into the cultural fabric dialogue here in the United States is one that China's feeding. Because the more of that Asian hate problem, which, by the way, is a terrible problem. We don't have issues with the Chinese. We don't have issues with the Japanese or the Koreans or the people of these nations. We have disputes and we have real problems with some nations' governments. And in particular, the Chinese government, we have a real issue with. And keep in mind, that's only not even 90 million people of the 1.4 billion in China. So any harassment or aggressive behavior or violence towards Chinese or other Asians is completely intolerable and un-American. But the fact that it's getting cobbled into this, well, we're really tough on China, maybe that's feeding the Asian hate thing, maybe we got to back off on China, that is something the Chinese Communist Party wants us essentially muddying. Right.
And they succeeded. I mean, wouldn't you say over the course of the last year, I'm not saying that we should all be walking around referring this as the, China cough or Chinese Wuhan virus or whatever, but like because they sort of were able to successfully muddy that water. Now I feel like it's actually the WHO report came out today. I feel like there's an easier argument to be made that like maybe people are more open to hearing that it didn't start in China, that it didn't originate in China. Like all of the CCP's propaganda, I feel like falls on more interested ears given the muddied waters on the origin of the virus. I don't know. Maybe I'm off base on that.
I can tell you firsthand, you're 100% right, because I worked 2 months with a reporter at a really great left-leaning platform on a feature article on my book and myself and sort of what I've been trying to pass on as a message. It was a fantastic article. And because of the Asian hate situation that was going on, the publication decided it was treading a little too close to that narrative. So they ended up killing the article. And by the way, as a business person and somebody who believes in free markets and capitalism, I can see, unfortunately, their argument. I don't agree with it, but it concerns me that we have somehow conflated the two issues so that they're now totally muddied together, and it's going to cause it to be way more complicated than it already is.
What did you think about what happened in Anchorage? I definitely want to get your thoughts on this because the right was really outraged by the way that Blinken and Jake Sullivan handled that situation and said because they sort of came in with this defensive posture and an unwillingness or just inability to really offer a strong defense of America from the attacks that were leveled by the Chinese representative, which, by the way, they go in along with exactly what we're just talking about. Attacking America along the lines of our own, failures when it comes to equality, or our own alleged failures when it comes to equality, using our history against us, history that we've spilled a lot of blood to overcome and to right the wrongs that were involved. What did you think of that? What did you make of it? Did you have the same position as a lot of people who were kind of outraged by how our country, or saddened by how our country looked? Or did you think maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed?
That's a super good question. A couple of things. I mean, one thing I talk about in my book is the fact that all these things that we're so upset at China about are a lot of the plays that we use from our own playbook as the United States of America in the early 1800s. When you look at tariffs, protectionist policies, stealing tech from European nations, various patents that we just took over to help spark our industrial revolution and help us catch up to them in lightning quick means. The same thing China's doing to us and our Western allies. The one difference is that at one point, the European nations said, hey, United States, enough is enough. You just built your economy on our backs. This is going to end. We need to level the playing field, make it fair. And quite frankly, we want to monetize your market now that you built on our back. So they did take a stand and we relented. And now, cut to this day, we have a relatively strong relationship with European nations. The same thing needs to happen with us in China. We need to use the playbook of Europe back in the early 1800s to use against China. Now, one thing that China is really good at, and I'd argue it's not because they're more innovative or smarter than us or whatever. The problem is our society has been so caught up in short-term, goals and rewards and outlooks, right? Like whether it's stock price fluctuations, quarterly results, 2 to 4 year election cycles, the fact that we have never ending election cycles, all that stuff plays into this idea that really all we're capable of doing to placate that type of mentality is play a game of checkers, right? Whereas China's been around 5,000 years. They plan things on 25, 50, 100-year time horizons, and that allows them to play a much better game of chess. If I look at what happened in Anchorage, I think they took some of that look in the mirror dialogue and then they ramped it up a bunch of notches. And a lot of that has to do with their full understanding of what's happening here with this cultural divide in this country. And they really pointed that out in a big way. Now, one other thing I'm going to bring up is that it's hard for me to be critical of such, disciplined experts that are in such powerful positions of government, right? Like no one knows exactly what is the right course. But if I did Monday morning quarterback that Alaska meeting, I would have said, you know what? We should have met with the Quad, which is India, Australia, and Japan, after Alaska versus before. And the only reason I say that is that that meeting symbolically was really a symbolic way of pushing China into a corner like a caged animal. So they had face loss. They felt like everybody was ganging up on them in a very short amount of time. And then suddenly they had to fly to Alaska to meet with us. They were not in a great mood to be super compliant or constructive in that meeting. And I think it would have been better for us to do that. And then right after that, say to them, oh yeah, this is going to be great. And then shoot over the Quad and say, okay, here's what they want to do. But like, this is what we have to do to stand up to them. That would have, I think, been a better approach and maybe got us better results. But yeah, I saw the commentary from both left and right wasn't great on how those meetings went. And the right was definitely relentless on the whole thing.
If you had to grade Blinken and Biden so far, what in terms of how they've handled China, what would you give them?
Well, so far there hasn't really been anything actively done or proactively done on top of what Trump has already implemented. I would say, if I'm grading them on just sort of overall positioning on where we're going with China, I would say I'd grade them at a pretty high mark. It looks like we're going to not take our foot off the gas. We're going to pressure them, and we're going to move things forward in a smart way, and hopefully get to some sort of rebalancing or recalculation of the bilateral relationship. If I look at what they haven't done, I would say that also gets good grades. They haven't backed off on a lot of the tariffs. And in fact, some of the things that were threatened by Trump, I think they're starting to initiate further, right? One of the things that I mentioned in the op-ed was the SEC and the fact that we still allow China to hide behind state secrets laws that prevent them or allow them to circumvent accounting practices standards that everybody else has to apply in order to get access to U.S. capital markets. In the case of the Biden administration, the SEC came out last Wednesday and said they're really starting to look at implementing that initiative for sure. And it caused a shudder throughout the Chinese companies that were traded on U.S. exchanges, that they might get delisted if they don't allow themselves to be properly audited.
I want to close by asking you about Chloe Zhao, who has this fascinating. So she's the director and I believe also the writer of Nomadland. She's fantastic. I mean, that film in and of itself, I think, is the best movie that I've seen this year and probably last year as well. There's some really interesting kind of dust up. She had previously made some comments that were actually scrubbed or corrected in publications that were perceived in China as being anti-China. And she, has said since that China is her homeland and et cetera, et cetera. But here we have a celebrated Chinese director, and she's actually facing some fire. I mean, China doesn't totally know what to do with her because Nomadland is a movie that, as one, I believe, a former Beijing professor pointed out, it makes America look bad from his perspective. It makes it look like our government isn't providing for our working class and is leaving people in dire straits, just like Frances McDormand's character in the film. What do you make of all of this as we're sort of heading towards Oscar season right now?
Well, number one is I'm sort of, and you started at the beginning of the question. I don't know why there hasn't been any scrutiny put on the publications that have actually removed some of her quotes, because I believe they were all Western publications.
Yes.
I mean, hello. What? I mean, literally, what the, F
right.
are they doing? But because of pressure from the Chinese government or Disney or something? No, you're journalists. You wrote a great article and there was something controversial in there. You keep it in there. That's so Chinese to take it out, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's unacceptable. Number two is, I think what we saw with these quotes being pulled from like 2013 or whatever they were is similar to what just happened with H&M and Nike, where they said certain things where they stood up against Xinjiang province cotton. And that was, one was, I think, last November. Another one was like a year ago. And it just looks as if the Chinese Communist Party just, takes all these nuggets and they store them in a little vault. And they're like, okay, when the time is right, we're going to pull them out and make a big controversy about it. So to answer your question about Chloe and the actual controversy itself and the movie, which, by the way, I think you told me you got to see the movie. I actually watched the movie, I believe, 2 weekends ago. And I actually really loved it. I thought it was a beautiful film. It's not for everyone, and it's definitely not something you want to see if you want to be, uplifted with some cheer. But it did remind me a little bit, and this is where I go, God, the Chinese Communist Party is super insecure, right? Because it's almost akin to House of Cards, right? House of Cards was a massive hit in China. No one monetized it from the West because it was just all black market. But the Chinese government loved that Chinese people were engaged in House of Cards because it made our government look really dirty and ineffective. Chloe's movie does the same thing about the American system. It's just not pretty. And you would think that the Chinese Communist Party would be pretty excited about people seeing and engaging in that film and talking about it with the netizens all out there doing that. The issue is really interesting because everybody's talking about Chloe and what does she do to get out of this jam. And remember, it's not just about Nomadland. Like, that's not a huge moneymaker. It's really about her and the fact that she directed one of the next Marvel movies that comes out next fall called The Eternals. That's a $200 million tentpole, and Marvel is the most valuable entertainment IP on earth in China's market. So if this toxic issue is still around when that movie comes out, that movie might not come out in China. Or if it does, it's going to fall on deaf ears. And that's yet another problem for Disney, which is still trying to get past the Mulan controversy and then the Raya and the Last Dragon bomb, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So what does she do to fix it? A lot of people are like, oh, she's got to, kowtow to them and apologize and, say that was so long ago and all that kind of stuff. I actually think, and I've argued this in the press in a couple articles, that that's just a symptom. Like her, apologizing is sort of like having a stuffed up nose from a really bad cold and using, some inhaler to breathe easier. You still don't get rid of the cold. I think the cold in her situation is that she is a born and raised Chinese citizen who went off to get educated in the West. And then she found herself in a very globally high profile business where she became one of the best in the world. And in fact, if she wins an Oscar or that movie wins multiple Oscars, she's going to be put on a pedestal as completely world class. And what is the issue for the Chinese Communist Party is that she doesn't live in China. She went off, educated elsewhere, finds her fame and fortune elsewhere. And unlike Yao Ming and many others, she doesn't go back to the homeland. She stays somewhere else. Why? Because she likes it better. It's better government. It's more free. It plays into all the things that she thinks are great being a human being living in another nation, which happens to be the United States of America. That is not a message. That is not something that the Chinese Communist Party wants their populace seeing and believing and thinking, ooh, I want to be Chloe too.
It's just so interesting how closely they pay attention to some of these cultural symbols and messages. It's fascinating. And I'm glad you mentioned the Marvel thing as well, because when we think about what might have, actually led to journalists changing their copy or correcting things or whatever it is. I mean, if you're getting, threats, if you're an entertainment journalist, you're getting threats of losing all your access to Disney. Well, you'll probably say, what's the harm?
I mean, I think, and I don't know for certain, so I'm just speculating, but if a call from Disney went to these publications to remove these quotes and somebody came out and talked about that, that is a major level of distrust of American values and principles and the freedom of speech and the freedom of journalism rights that we all think we're protecting here in the United States of America. So I really hope that wasn't the case, but it looks sort of like that was the case. So I don't know what to make of it. And I'm surprised it hasn't been a bigger story itself.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. Well, and it's just one of the many things that you talk about, similar to one of the many things that you talk about in your book, Feeding the Dragon Inside the $1 Trillion Dilemma Facing Hollywood. And everyone should get a copy and read it. Chris Fenton, thank you so much for your time once again today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And anybody who wants to engage more in this stuff, I see the Dragon Feeder, which is my Twitter handle. And then I also get more in depth on stuff on Feeding the Dragon podcast, where we break down a lot of these current events and talk about them in a fun, engaging way. So I highly recommend it, and join us for some of those.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Chris, thank you for your time. We will be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.